Mr. Oldcastle was very cheerful. It was August, he was on holiday in Scotland, and best of all, he was driving his vintage car, Gumdrop. "I may even get a photograph of the Loch Ness Monster herself, if there is such a thing," he said to his dog Horace. Nobody had taken a good photograph of her yet, though. On the way to Loch Ness, the road was blocked by a huge lorry. "Ah, some real Scotsmen at last," said Mr. Oldcastle, taking their photograph. "Och, I stop taking them there pictures," shouted McBurp. "Get that crock out of here," snarled McClurk. "Get this darned dog off me," shrieked McSneak. Horace didn't like him. These men are so rude, thought Mr. Oldcastle, and they have such peculiar Scottish accents. When they arrived at Loch Ness, there were lots of photographers there already. "Hey, you're just in time," said Professor Cyrus B. Whoppertaker. "The monster will appear tomorrow, they've told us." Mr. Waterpitcher of the Sunday Pics said that the monster's picture would be worth thousands of pounds, but Mr. Oldcastle preferred to be alone and drove on. Suddenly, a huge lorry came roaring towards him. He braked hard, skidded, and lurched into the loch. Splash! Mr. Oldcastle and Horace scrambled to dry land. "Och, I serves you right," snarled the lorry driver. It was none other than McBurp. "Get the old banger out yourself," jeered McClurk. "And do it quick," warned McSneak. "We need this spot for something special tomorrow." And off they drove. There was no one about, and Mr. Oldcastle couldn't pull Gumdrop out, so they decided to wait until the morning. They did their best to sleep. Suddenly, Mr. Oldcastle woke up. Was he still dreaming? For Gumdrop was going slowly up the bank. He rubbed his eyes. There was no one pulling. There must be someone pushing. Swirly waves came from the loch, and something like a tail was sticking out. What? Who? Surely not. Yes, it was the Loch Ness Monster. It was real. Mr. Oldcastle remembered his manners. "Thank you very much, ma'am," he stammered. "Oh, not at all," replied Mrs. Nessie. "We can't allow that beautiful car to get rusty." Then she told him how worried she was about the crowds. "I hate those terrible flash cameras," she said. Mr. Oldcastle decided to help. "If you would kindly get into Gumdrop, I'll take you to a nearby loch until the fuss is over." Mrs. Nessie was delighted. She squeezed in, and Mr. Oldcastle drove very slowly. Horace guarded the monster's tail. Mr. Oldcastle settled Nessie in the hideaway loch and returned to Loch Ness. He was stopped by the rude men. "The monster will be appearing this morning, och I," said McBurp with his false accent. "Spectators only £10, photographs only £100, grinned McClurk. Mr. Oldcastle didn't stop. The shore was crowded with photographers. This was the last day of the monster season, and they had all paid a lot of money. Suddenly, a huge monster plopped up like a cork, making enormous waves. The cameras clicked, and its large tail knocked people over. "This is dangerous," cried Mr. Oldcastle and drove off. But it was too late. The monster's tail caught in Gumdrop's wheel and got twisted round and round. Then the monster exploded in 1,000 pieces. Professor Whoppertaker was knocked over. "It's plastic," he cried. "It's a fake." They all turned their cameras on Gumdrop, who had revealed the truth about the monster. Mr. Oldcastle didn't say a word about Mrs. Nessie. It was, of course, McBurp and his men who did it. They were really London crooks called Burp, Lurk and Sneak. They hurried away now that their plastic monster had exploded. Little did they know that Horace had taken their bag with all the money in. They shouldn't have kept their sausages in it. Mr. Oldcastle gave the photographers their money back, and next day they made the headlines in all the newspapers. Then Mr. Oldcastle went to fetch Nessie and take her back home. "Oh, you're very kind," she said. "If you care to take a photograph, meet me by the castle at midday tomorrow." Next morning, Mr. Oldcastle was ready. Punctually at midday, Mrs. Nessie appeared, then her husband, Mr. Monster, and their 5 little monsters all in a row. Mr. Oldcastle took a photograph such as the world had never seen before, but he promised Mrs. Nessie that he'd never show it to anyone.